All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We're very pleased to be joined today by the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mark Lowcock. And along with him, you have the Food and Agriculture Organization's Director of Emergencies, Dominique Burgeon, and the FAO Senior Locust Forecasting Officer, Keith Cressman. And they are all here to brief you on the desert locust upsurge in the Greater Horn of Africa. I believe we'll start first with Mr. Lowcock, who I think will have to go fairly quickly, and then turn to our FAO guests.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you so much for coming. And we are awash with humanitarian challenges around the world at the moment. You all cover them very fully. I'm grateful for that. And one of the things we're seeing is when we have a new problem that we think is really, really challenging, it's really difficult to get enough attention to it because there's so much else going on. And that's why I just wanted myself to come and offer you a few comments, really, about this locust threat we see in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere, and why I think we really, really need to pull our fingers out, to be very candid with you, and get across it now. So last month, and Dominique and Keith will give you lots of detail and the sort of broad picture and so on. But I just want to give you a few slightly more atmospheric points from me, representing why I'm alarmed about this. Last month, there was a swarm of, we think, between 100 and 200 billion locusts in Kenya. They have the capacity, it covers something like 240 kilometres square. They have the capacity to consume the same amount of people as 84 million people in one day. $100 to 200 billion locusts, 240 kilometres squared, 84 million people. 2,400. Sorry, 2,400. What did I say?
240.
Oh, 2,400. So 10 times the size of what I said. 2,400. When I started to look at these numbers, it took me a while to get my head around them. But the more I thought about it, the more seized I was. Now, there are 13 million people in the affected countries, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, who are severely food insecure now. 10 million of those people are in the places affected by the locusts. And I don't think you need to be a rocket science to put two and two together. So on the 22nd, 23rd of January, the Food and Agriculture Organization, Chu Dong-yu, the Director General, launched basically an alert and a response plan for $76 million to try and deal with this problem, most of which is dealt with by surveillance and control, including spraying and other things. And on the same day, I released $10 million from the Central Emergency Response Fund. That was an unusual thing for me to do, because normally what I'm releasing money from the SURF from is for problems where there are people starving and dying right now. I released this money because it was clear to me, unless there was a rapid response, we were going to have a huge problem later in the year, the cost of which would be much, much higher to deal with. And so this is in the space that the Central Emergency Response Fund is using a bit more of anticipating problems and avoiding them causing huge loss of life and huge expense to deal with by acting much earlier on them. And I did it partly because I was hoping that early surf action would encourage others to respond rapidly as well. Now, unfortunately, what we've had so far against that $76 million appeal is just $20 million, half of which has come from the surf. So Dominique and I and Keith, with help from Chu Dong-yu, have just done a member state briefing here for the member states, just trying to draw people's attention to the fact that unless we get a grip of this in the next 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, we're worried we're going to have a really, really serious problem. We can make a lot of progress if we act now, and FAO have put in place lots of the things that need to be done to act now. The binding constraint is the money. And our plea really is for those member states and other organisations who are thinking of doing something about this, don't think for too long before you get a response in place, because there's a very small window. Now, the last thing I want to say really is that we think, and again, Keith and Dominique can say more about this, that one of the reasons we have this problem now to a greater degree than we've seen, I mean, this is the worst for 70 years in Kenya, for 25 years in Ethiopia and Somalia. One of the reasons we have this problem now is climatic. More cyclones in the Indian Ocean and the kind of weather patterns we've seen are have been providing more pasture, if I've got that, I think I've got that right, for the locusts to feed off and breed and create this threat. So this is another dimension of the climate emergency, which is something we need to have a medium-term response to. But my call to action now is on the very short-term issue. $76 million in the great scheme of things is not a huge amount of money. Not providing it, or most of it, could leave us with a really major problem. So that was the thing I wanted to say. Really, it's just to introduce Dominique and Keith. And I think I'm catching up with quite a lot of them shortly, actually, on a wider range of other problems. I'm certainly hoping to do that. And I'm sorry not to have longer now, Farhan, but thank you at least for giving me a chance to say a few things to you on this particular topic. Thank you very much indeed. Obviously. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And I guess we'll turn to our next speaker, Mr. Burgeon.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to address the noon briefing for us. It's indeed we need your support. We need to mobilize to make people realize that time for action is actually now. And perhaps I can take it and give you a bit more of background, taking it from where the emergency relief coordinator left it, to say, he referred to these cyclones that have occurred in the Indian Ocean. Actually, what happened is that in May and October 2018, there were two rather large cyclones that brought a lot of moisture to the so-called empty quarter, which is an area between Yemen, Oman and Saudi Arabia, which is an area that cannot be accessed because of the natural condition there, and where locusts have been breeding really big time, at scale, multiplying by a factor 8,000 in a couple of generations. Then what happened is that these locusts moved south and north. For those moving south, they moved into Yemen, and in Yemen again they found very good conditions in terms of humidity, etc., in the soil for them to lay eggs and turn into 1 or 2 more generations. And then what happened when the conditions dried out, I would say, in Yemen, they moved. They moved around June 2019. They moved to northeastern Ethiopia and north Somalia. And then from there, they moved into northeastern Somalia and eastern Ethiopia. And then normally, this was around October. And then normally, at this time of the year, again, conditions dry out. And I would say the control operations that were ongoing by the government themselves, as well as the fact that the condition dry out, I mean, are such that the pressure of the locust population normally decrease, and there is some sort of control. The problem is that on 7th of December, there was another massive cyclone that reached exactly those areas in Ethiopia, Somalia, where the locusts were. So it means that, again, this cyclone created fantastic conditions for the locust to multiply and to have another 1-2 generation of locusts. And this is why, I mean, these conditions have resulted in, again, breeding of locusts, new generation, that have then moved south. And this is why on 28th of December, we had invasion of locusts in Kenya. And in Kenya, there has been since then massive quantities of locusts arriving in Kenya and now multiplying in Kenya, where the conditions are also good for locusts to breed. So now we have a situation in Kenya where we have 15 counties in north and center Kenya that are affected. We have also, as of actually last night, we got report that now we have, in addition to Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, we have Uganda and Tanzania that are also affected. So it's spreading. So now we have, in all these countries, we have mature, especially in Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, we have mature swarms that are laying eggs, and we see that there is a new generation coming. This, what will happen now is that this new generation will be at its more, I would say, voracious stage at the time of the next planting season. So this is, I think, and this is why, I mean, in our discussion with the Emergency Relief Coordinator, we have very much discussed this anticipatory action. Because I think you have to realize that when you look at the crop calendar of that part of the world, we are, as we speak, in between two planting seasons. So the locust came before, when it was towards the end of the previous cropping season. Therefore, damages in the previous seasons are relatively limited. Now they are breeding big time, and they will be ready, I would say, for very large damage as of March and April. So this to say that this is really now that we need to mobilize attention to really be able to go at scale with control operations. I think it's important to highlight, of course, that FAO, primarily we are working in support of the government. I think the government in all these countries have been doing a great job. But as was said by the Emergency Relief Coordinator, this is an event that is occurring very rarely. I mean, 25 years since we didn't see such a situation in Ethiopia, Somalia, 70 years since we saw it in Kenya. So it means countries are really trying to do their best, but their capacities are overwhelmed. And this is why FAO issued an appeal to the international community, of course, in full consultation with the countries to make sure that we augment their capacities. An appeal that, first and foremost, aims at controlling desert locusts through a number of means. I mean, for example, using aerial spraying when there are swarms, but also using ground control, ground spraying when they are at what we call upper stage. So they are not flying yet. Also supporting the countries in terms of the surveillance, providing them with the required expertise. But then, in the meantime, realizing that, as was said by the Emergency Relief Coordinator, we are in an area where the level of acute food insecurity is already very high. We have 13 million people in acute food insecurity. And at the top of these 13 million people, we have another 20 million people that are on the verge, I would say, of acute food insecurity. So it means if these guys are exposed to another shock, they've been already, I would say, made vulnerable by the drought and the floods that have occurred in the area. Now, if they have one more shock, they may fall into acute food insecurity. So we have a big risk of a tremendous humanitarian situation to further, deteriorate and to have a worsening of the humanitarian situation in the region. So that's why we need, one, to control, but in the meantime, we need to support the livelihood of these people. The livelihood that is based on farming, but that is also based on pastoralism. Pastoralist communities are very badly hit because, as was said, these locusts are eating huge quantities per day, including pasture. So it means it will be, when we look at data from previous, for example, plague in 87, 89, we were talking in countries like Mali and Niger of an impact on the pasture of 50% reduction on the availability of grass. So it means very, very significant. Therefore, need to support, of course, the pastoralist communities by providing additional feed, treatments of animal, and so on and so forth. And then, also, for us, it's about augmenting the capacities of the government technically, promote cross-border coordination. We are talking of a transboundary pest, meaning that the locusts are moving from one country to another. Therefore, we need to work on the coordination among countries. And this is why we are working very closely with the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, in the region, with whom we are co-chairing the Food Security and Nutrition Working Group, therefore trying to promote at scale action. So the critical point is that we have issued an appeal of $76 million. So far, we have received $21 million, meaning that we have issued an appeal of $76 million. We have received so far $21 million, including FAO tapping its own resources to the tune of $3.8 million. That we have injected as part of treating this situation as a corporate priority for the entire organization. The Director General, Mr. Chu Dongyu, has decided that it should be treated as a corporate priorities, and that therefore all possible efforts should be made, including releasing our own financial resources to indeed support the countries. So it means we have a huge gap. Unless this gap is filled like now in the coming days and very few weeks, not weeks with a big S, but with a small S, there will be huge humanitarian needs, and we may meet again when we are going to announce a huge increase in the number of people in acute food insecurity, and when we are going to this time ask for the whole package, including massive food assistance. So big risk. So we need to raise the flag. We need to make sure that countries respond at scale. A number of them have already responded. Most of the, we are having conversation with most of the key resource partners, but now it's important that these conversations turn into concrete funding in the weeks and days, preferably, to come. Of course, we are working very closely with OCHA. We are also working with the World Food Programme, to assess the impact, but also to augment logistical capacities of the countries. So then, I'll perhaps leave it there and ask my colleagues, if you agree, Keith, to give us an idea of the worst-case scenario, how it could look like. Perhaps.
Sure.
Mr. Cressman, Keith Cressman.
Thank you very much. Let me just reiterate a little bit on the consequences of not acting in time and how do the locusts respond. As Dominique has mentioned, this is the most dangerous migratory pest in the world. And they have this tremendous capacity to eat their own weight in food. And a swarm, of course, contains tens or hundreds of millions of insects. So if you do the math, of course, it becomes very, very voracious. I know it's hard to imagine this here sitting in this room, but all of you kind of know how big Manhattan is here in New York City. And so just think of a swarm that covers Manhattan from the south up to the north. And this is just a medium-sized swarm. It's not really a big swarm for desert locusts. That swarm in one day can eat the same amount of food as the entire population of Kenya. That swarm in one day can eat the same amount of food as everybody here in the tri-state area, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York. So the potential is tremendous that we should not underestimate by any means. So not taking action in time, you can see the consequences. We've seen this year, Kenya, for example, has received waves and waves of swarms since the end of last year up until this morning when we're talking. So 5 weeks of swarms keep coming into the country. This is insightful in the sense of showing you, the production of the swarms as a result of that cyclone Pawan that Dominique mentioned further north in northeastern Somalia and eastern Ethiopia. It shows that there are large areas of infestations in both those countries that are not well known. We know they're there, but it's very difficult to access them, especially when there's insufficient resources. Those swarms that came into Kenya, last time they did this was 2007, so 13 years ago. And it was the same scenario. They originated in Yemen. The swarms migrated across the Gulf of Aden into the Horn of Africa and moved into Kenya at the end of the year. However, that problem was over in 1 month because there was only a few swarms. The Kenyan government reacted very quickly. End of story. This year is completely different. Those swarms didn't just stay in the northeastern corner of the country. They spread through all of the counties in the north and the center of the country. As Dominique mentioned, over the weekend they invaded, they moved on the side of Mount Kilimanjaro across the border into Tanzania, into Arusha and Moshi. Also on the weekend they moved across the border into northeastern Uganda. We're expecting any day they will move across the border into the southeast corner of South Sudan. And you all know the challenges in South Sudan normally. So this is a new challenge. But in addition to this movement, which is one thing because they're migratory pests, the second thing is that they found good conditions in northern Kenya and central Kenya, which is not normal for this time of year. They've had some rains south of that cyclone. So this means that they've laid eggs over a huge area of Kenya. And we're still evaluating how big that is, but it could stretch from the border of Somalia to the border of Uganda, that entire northern strip, the semi-arid area of Kenya, which the locusts love. We've already seen now the hatching started, and we will see a lot more hatching coming this month. And after the hatching, of course, you have the wingless hoppers. They're like moving carpets on the sand. You can't see the ground. It's just a solid carpet. And after 6 weeks, those then turn into new swarms. So as Dominique mentioned, that the formation of the new generation of swarms will exactly coincide with the rainy season start and the planting. And often in the past, when farmers are faced with such a scenario, they don't plant. So again, tremendous repercussions on food security and livelihoods. Now, if that's not enough, those swarms that form at the beginning of the planting season, then, of course, after 1 month, they're mature and they're ready to lay eggs again. And the whole cycle continues. So the timing of that next generation of swarms would coincide with the harvest. So obviously, this is not good news for a farmer in the Horn of Africa. And in addition to that, because we're dealing with the geographical spread of locusts, the winds change. They will change starting next month, and they will be from the south to the north. So the good news is that Kenya will not be receiving any more swarms from Ethiopia and Somalia. The bad news is that there will be a very widespread reinvasion from Kenya into Ethiopia and Somalia. And Ethiopia is a country that has extremely diverse agricultural practices and habitats. So it is a smorgasbord. It's a buffet for desert locusts, basically. And there's a risk that they will expand from the Rift Valley in the south, which is the one breadbasket of the country, all the way north to the highlands bordering Eritrea between now and June. And these are very diverse and rich environments for locusts, but also very difficult to undertake survey and control operations. In addition, starting when the new generation forms start and commence later in March and early April, as the winds are from the south, they'll not only reinvade Ethiopia and Somalia, but the western portion of those swarms in West Kenya, they will invade South Sudan again. So although South Sudan has a very high risk of invasion of the current swarms now in the coming days, they have another risk that they will be facing in about 2 months from now. And those swarms obviously are trying to reach the desert areas of Sudan, North Sudan, Khartoum area. And that includes Darfur, another area that's very difficult to operate in. So the risk, the imminent risk, of course, is to Kenya and Ethiopia and Somalia now and to the next planting season. But it's also, the risk is to spread further into other countries. And if you think that's not enough, because they're so migratory, these desert locusts, because in the past, in the late 80s, they crossed from West Africa across the Atlantic Ocean to the Caribbean. So they have this amazing capacity to migrate. I mean, they cross the Atlantic in 10 days, arriving in the Caribbean. So around June, when you have this huge swarm production of this next generation, those that are moving and interested in migrating, they will collect in the northeast corner of the Horn of Africa, northeastern Somalia. And at that time of year, the end of May, early part of June, we have the southwest monsoon rains that feed the monsoon to the subcontinent of India. And so that is like a direct flight from northeastern Somalia across the Indian Ocean to both sides of the India-Pakistan border, the deserts there. And they would very easily maneuver that, fly over the ocean, and reach those areas in time for the monsoon coming up from South India. So you see the interrelations between the desert locusts and nature. These guys are professional survivorists. They've been doing this for eons. They've gone through climate change, and they've survived very well, probably better than we will. So the risk is now the Horn of Africa, but by summertime it could conceivably expand to northern Africa and to Southwest Asia. Now, in response to that risk, just last week, the Prime Minister of Pakistan has declared a national emergency for locusts, mainly for anticipatory action, for preparation that can be done now until about May in order to respond to such an invasion and then deal with the subsequent breeding. This past year, there was 3 generations of breeding on both sides of the India-Pakistan border. If you remember, Dominique was talking about how it started in 2018 in the Arabian Peninsula, and then some moved south to Yemen in the Horn of Africa, and the others moved north. Those that moved north, they went into southern Iran last spring. And there's unusually heavy flooding. And those locusts normally are just concentrated near the Pakistan border. Last year, they were in the entire southern border from Iraq to Pakistan, more than 1,000 miles. They got into areas that had not seen locusts in 50 years. So the response was difficult. But in addition, on top of that, there's the sanctions in Iran. So the Iranians, although they responded very well, they did not have the right pesticide to have a good impact on the locusts. And so as a result, there was a very significant invasion to the India-Pakistan desert areas at the beginning of the summer. But both those countries, India and Pakistan, only faced an invasion from one source, Iran last year. This year, they will face an invasion from 2 sources. Again from Iran, where breeding is underway, but also from the Horn of Africa. So last year may have been just kind of warm-up for them. The other concern, of course, that we have, and this is one of the main reasons why FAO has launched very rapidly this appeal and why OSHA has responded very quickly with the SURF funding, is where it's taking place now in the Horn of Africa. It's occurring in countries that normally do not have locusts. And this is very important because there are countries that face locusts every year, from West Africa to India, and they have very strong national programs to address those issues. they have well-trained teams out to go in the desert and monitor, look for the green vegetation and the locusts, and do control operations when they find sufficient targets. And they do this every year to different levels, but they have a program ready. It's like having a fire department ready with the fire engines and the tankers and the hoses and everything. But a country like Kenya that last saw desert locusts in 2007, and before that was 1957, so twice in the last 70 years, of course their capacities, they don't have such programs. So the capacities are limited in order to respond quickly enough and at a high enough scale or magnitude. The same is with Tanzania, the same with Uganda, the same with South Sudan. So this is our concern. When locusts start to spread into these non-frontline countries, into these invasion countries, it can become extremely problematic. And for the locusts, if the weather continues to cooperate, then they just continue to increase in these rapid numbers. I just say one more thing and then I'll finish. Since this whole, let's say, evolution of the problem started a year and a half ago, there's been an estimated increase of 64 million times the number of locusts. 64 million times in a year and a half. So it's an exponential increase along this chain of events. And so if that chain of events is not broken somewhere, either by intervention, by control operations, or by a break in the favorable weather, this just keeps going. And in the past, we've seen locust plagues in the 1940s and 50s that would last up to 14 consecutive years in a row. Now we don't see that very often because we have much better technologies to monitor and control. But when nature is favorable to the locusts, then it becomes much more challenging. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. We'll open up the floor for questions. Please identify the person to whom you're directing a question. Valeria goes first.
Thank you so much for this press conference on behalf of ANCA. Valeria Robecco from ANSA News West Service. My question is, you said that this phenomenon is connected with the climate emergency. So we are still in time to fix it, to change something in our habit to fix this kind of phenomenon. And there is the risk to have similar phenomenon right now also in Europe and North America. Thank you.
Sure. No is a short answer. Basically, desert locust is an old world species, so they are confined to the arid and hyper-arid and semi-arid areas of Africa and the Middle East and Southwest Asia. The movement to across the Atlantic to the Caribbean was an anomaly. It was a very rare movement, and they were unable to establish themselves in the Americas. It's just out of their habitat. The same with Europe. In the past, there have been movements from West Africa to the UK, up the eastern side of the Atlantic. But when they get in these very, very long-distance movements, they get into areas that it's just not their habitat. It's kind of like a polar bear in the desert. It's not going to survive for long. So there is not a risk, of course, to the Americas or to Northern Europe. Now, having said that, of course, in the last upsurge in 2003, 2005, there were southerly movements towards the north in West Africa. It did reach the Canary Islands. It reached the very southern coast of Portugal, the Algarve area, and the southern parts of Spain and Sicily and Italy. But again, they do not become established there. They don't breed there. They don't increase in numbers. So that's the big difference.
I want to add also to your point, because I think what we have clarified during this presentation is that the whole thing was triggered and maintained by very favorable conditions that were brought essentially by a number of cyclones. First on the empty quarter, and then the one that was really the trigger point, this Pawam in December 19. But what we see with climate change, one of the impact of climate change is more frequent, more intense type of extreme events. So when we know that these extreme events are going to occur more often, our role is to make sure that the countries are better equipped to deal with this new normal. And to deal with this new normal, we know that, for example, countries like that, the probability for countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, and others to be faced with that sort of locust situation is increased. Therefore, while we respond on an emergency humanitarian perspective right now, we will need to build up their capacities to handle such situation in the future, to adjust to this new normal. And one thing is that when we looked at the total cost of the upsurge in the Sahel in 2003, 2005, to control it, the total investment was around $570 million. This $570 million is equivalent to 170 years of preventive work for 10 countries. So it means that it's important not only to do the humanitarian at-scale response right now, but also to make sure that the countries are properly equipped to handle these situations very early on when they occur.
Edie.
Thank you very much, Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. 2 questions. First, you talked about 20 million people being potentially on the brink of humanitarian food insecurity. Where are those people located? And when you talk about possible catastrophe, disaster, are we talking about the possibility of famine? On my second question is about money in the appeal. So you've appealed for $21 million. You got 10 from SURF. So basically that's 11 million, and FAO put in 3.8 million. So that means basically you've only gotten about $7 million from outside donors. What was the reaction today when you met with countries, and why do you think that the donor community isn't taking this seriously?
Well, first of all, to respond on your question on the 20 million. So these numbers, they are based on the so-called integrated food security phase classification, which is a mechanism by which FAO and other partners, basically all the actors on the ground working on food security information, gather the result of all their assessments and classify the various areas of countries at district level, etc., working in cooperation with the government to make sure that it is really solid. So we have indeed 13 million people in Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Djibouti, 5 countries, that are currently in acute food insecurity. I mean, they are either in IPC phase 3, IPC phase 4. IPC phase 5 is famine. So it means that these people, they already need to cut on the quantity of food, on the number of meals. They need to sell their assets. They need to sell their animals. They are in acute food insecurity. This is there are already even some people dying that could die in these conditions of extreme food insecurity. The category just below is the 20 million people I'm talking about in the same 5 countries. And these people, indeed, are at risk of falling in acute food insecurity. Therefore, in going into what we call negative coping strategies. I mean, there were some feedback, I think, from the 1987 plague in the Sahel that is even documenting a significant drop in school enrollment. So this is part of the negative coping strategies people are using. So this is very important to realize that when you go basically into the next phase before famine, it is the stage where you basically sell all your belongings. You are desperate. You are trying just to feed yourself. So this is the type of situation we have in the region. So if you are asking if there is acute hunger in this country as we speak, yes, there is acute hunger. And as Mark Lowcock was saying, if you look at the map, we have already about 10 million people in these countries that are in acute food insecurity and that are in acute food insecurity in areas where locusts are. So it means their situation can only deteriorate if we do not act, not only to control the locusts, but also to beef up to support, to boost their capacity to cope, enabling them to keep their animals producing wherever they can. 76 million, yes, we briefed the partners. Actually, we have been briefing in Nairobi 2 weeks ago. Last week we briefed in Geneva. We briefed in Rome. Today we briefed in New York. So we had a high-level meeting last Friday in the margin of the AU summit in Addis as well. So we have been raising a lot of attention on the matter. We know, and we have, there is a lot of interest on the part of the big donors. We know that they are talking, that they are trying to move resources as they can to indeed provide a net-scale response. Because I think the difficulty here, even for most of the resource partners, is, as Mark Lowcock said, even when he explained the difficulty, he had, there is not yet at scale, I would say, impact on the ground as we speak, but we know it's coming, and therefore he decided to release anticipatory action fund. So all the main resource partners are having exactly the same type of thinking. They are trying to find the resources so that we can get access to prevent a massive deterioration of the food security situation. And we are confident, no, they got the message. They are all committed to anticipatory action. They have to walk the talk, and they have to come up with at-scale resources to enable us to do the job.
Sherwin?
Thanks, Farhan. Sherwin Briceby, South African Broadcasting. You can decide who answers. When exactly is the planting season in East Africa? Could you just give us a specific time frame? And no one's mentioned Al-Shabaab, right? The terrorist group, Al-Qaeda-linked terrorist group in East Africa. How does that factor into your planning in terms of combating this? And my understanding is, planes have to fly over and spray crops. What risk does that involve?
Okay, so planting season. Of course, planting season is planting calendars vary a lot from one country to another. But of course, it's influenced by the rain. That it's true with the impact of climate change. Tend to be late, tend to be not very well distributed, and so on and so forth. This said, in general, planting season starts in March, April, and harvest is toward July. So, roughly, you have to know that now is the main season. So it's the season, the one that is coming, is the one where there should be the bulk of the production in these countries. So it's important to bear in mind that if we let it go, if we do not control, this will have a tremendous impact. Now, your question, you can imagine that the Al-Shabaab question, we had it many times. We are just coming out. We were in Puntland last week, in Garowe, reviewing the situation where we saw a lot of upper bands. So the locusts without the wing at a younger stage, where they are the scarpet thing that Keith was talking about. So it means swarms are developing, will be coming. Now, two things. We are confident that in Somaliland and Puntland we'll be able to do air control operations. We are committed to negotiate access wherever possible to make sure that we can indeed spray wherever it is possible to spray. This said, I think what you have to realize is that we don't need to kill the locust to the last. We don't need to find the last locust to make sure that this is... What we need to do is to reduce the burden, to reduce the overall quantity of locust that is in the system, if I may say. So this is why wherever it is possible to control we will do control. In other areas, using our traditional means, we will support the livelihood of the where we don't have access. What we will do is to try to support the livelihood of the communities that are impacted.
So what's the answer on Al-Shabaab?
No, the answer on Al-Shabaab is that we work wherever we have access, and we try to negotiate access to spray wherever we can in these areas.
Do you negotiate with terrorists?
No. No. I'm not saying that. No. I'm saying for the moment we are focused on the areas where we have access. Please don't misquote me.
Yes, you had a question?
I know this is a more complicated question, but what do they eat? What are they eating?
No, it's a very simple question. They eat everything. They're omnivorous. They eat everything. You know, desert locusts, as their name implies, they first start in the desert. And so they prefer that natural vegetation that sprouts up after the rains and then disappears after, a very short-lived time, 3 or 4 weeks, 5 weeks, something like that. But, when you have large numbers of locusts, then they're consuming all of this natural vegetation. So then they get their next food of choice is the pasture areas, the grasses that are important for the herders and the pastoralists. And then they get into those fringe areas along the edge of the desert, where there's a rain-fed subsistence crops, the smallholders. They're growing millet, sorghum, these crops that are important for their own livelihoods that probably don't show up in the national food statistics in the country. Then after that, they get into the more developed cropping areas, the agricultural areas, the vegetable areas, the fruit areas, and then of course they can have effect in terms of the export crops.
Evelyn?
Thank you. Evelyn Leopold, Independent Media Institute. Can you describe where you are spraying right now and the success of it? For example, in Kenya, can you stop the spread there, or is it impossible?
Yes, at the moment, there's about 5 aircraft that are operating in Kenya that are spraying, undertaking the control operations. There's a similar number in Ethiopia. In addition to those aircraft, there's helicopters that they're being used to find the targets, of course, the swarms and then soon their progeny. As Dominique mentioned, whatever you do, of course, is going to reduce the numbers. The big question is, are you doing enough to reduce enough numbers? And the answer to that question is no, we're not. And it's a question of funding, of course. With more money, you can do more things. But certainly, the efforts that have been undertaken now, if they had not been successful or not undertaken, we would have seen much larger numbers of swarms already in Tanzania, already in Uganda, already in South Sudan. So we're not seeing that. But we know that the spread and just the huge numbers of swarms that have arrived in Kenya and moved throughout the northern and central parts of the country, it has overwhelmed the aerial control services. So this is why we're making a very urgent appeal for very rapid action to upscale these operations now.
Are they at Kilimanjaro, and if so, how?
Excuse me?
Are they at Kilimanjaro, the locust, and if so, how?
Yes, what happened over the weekend was that they had a weather system, of course, that had some northerly winds that brought some of those locusts from the central parts of the country south of Nairobi, reaching Amboseli Park and the national parks at the foothills of Kilimanjaro. That was on Saturday, and then it's just a few swarms, but of course there may be more coming. And some of those swarms then moved across the border on to the west and to the eastern sides of Kilimanjaro into northern Tanzania, Arusha and the Moshi areas. Yeah. But as it has been mentioned many times, these locusts, they don't need passports, they don't need visas, they don't have to go through customs or immigration. They just fly right across the border. It's a single habitat for them.
Okay, Stefano.
Yes, Stefano Baccara, La Voce in New York. I want to go back on the reason why, what the attribution of what I understand is climate change has a lot to do with that. Now, I don't want to be the devil's advocate, but that biblical time, we in the Bible we hear about those things happening, or at least they describe things happening. So, how sure you are that this has to do with climate change, or is something to do where it happens? I mean, every 30, 40 years happens, or because I think if we want to fight climate change, I mean, this gives. So somebody that's skeptical will say, "Oh, you attribute this to climate change. This is always happening in the history of it." At least, no.
It's an excellent question, in fact, because many people are perhaps a bit too quick to attribute everything to climate change, and any kind of disruption on this planet, it's now climate change. I think what's important to understand here is the context. First of all, historically, locust plagues, the trigger has been cyclones. And that is very well documented in our, at least in our recent knowledge of desert locusts since about the mid-1800s. So over that period of time, many of those locust plagues that occurred were initiated by cyclones coming from the Indian Ocean, bringing these heavy rains to the Arabian Peninsula to the Horn of Africa. Now, what we've seen in the last decade is that there has been an increase of cyclones in the Indian Ocean. Most recently in the last 3 to 4 years. So, for example, the cyclones that Dominique mentioned in 2018, very unusual to have 2 cyclones in the same year, the beginning of the summer and the end of the summer, hit the same area in the Arabian Peninsula. In 2019, there are 8 cyclones alone in the Indian Ocean. There's usually 1 or 2 at most, or none. And this is all due to the Indian Ocean dipole. It's kind of like the El Nino, but it's in the Indian Ocean. And basically it means that the western side of the Indian Ocean is wetter and the eastern side is drier. And that's why we have these tremendous wildfires in Australia. So the point is, if we see a continuation in this trend of cyclones, whether this can be attributed to climate change or not is probably less important than to know that if there is this increased trend, for sure we'll see an increased trend in terms of outbreaks and upsurges of desert locusts like what we see now. I think that's the main point.
Okay. And I would like once more to thank our guests from the Food and Agriculture Organization, the Director of Emergencies, Dominique Burgeon, and the Senior Locust Forecasting Officer, Keith Cressman. Thanks very much for this briefing.